Welcome to the Catholic Cafe, where Catholic truth is served fresh daily. We've made you a reservation in the luxurious corner booth, so come on in and see what's on the menu today. Now, here's your host, Deacon Jeff Drzymski.
Greetings and welcome to the Catholic Cafe. I'm Deacon Jeff, sitting in the luxurious corner booth of the Catholic Cafe. We got the band back together. We got Venerable Tom.
Hello.
Is here, and we have Ziggy Rodriguez.
That's me.
And so you guys, I'm glad we're all sitting here. And
thanks for having us, Deej.
You know what? It's my pleasure.
Thank you.
Have a donut.
Oh, yeah, better.
With sprinkles.
Yes.
So today we're going to have I think an interesting show, because really just an experience I had. And I know that as I say these things,
well, then you know it's going to be interesting.
A lot of people have the same kind of experience. I know you've been sitting at Mass. I was at a daily Mass, and just, you know, sometimes you're sitting there and then all of a sudden you just hear something just in one of the readings, and sometimes, like for me, it's the Old Testament, and all of a sudden this image kind of passed into my head. I mean, and it's like I couldn't shake it. It was really an interesting thing, and something that I was familiar with the story, but I didn't really know that I'd never thought about it in this way. And the story is when the Queen of Sheba goes to visit King Solomon, right? The wise Solomon. And it was just that reading. And there's a part of that just like leaped out at me, and it had never happened before. I'm going to read that reading. It's from the first book of Kings in the 10th chapter is where it starts. And it says, "The Queen of Sheba, having heard a report of Solomon's fame, came to test him with subtle questions. She arrived in Jerusalem with a very numerous retinue, and with camels bearing spices, a large amount of gold, and precious stones. She came to Solomon and spoke to him about everything that she had on her mind. King Solomon explained everything she asked about, and there was nothing so obscure that the king could not explain it to her. When the Queen of Sheba witnessed Solomon's great wisdom, the house he had built, the food at his table, the seating of his ministers, the attendance and dress of his waiters, his servers, and the burnt offerings he offered in the house of the Lord, it took her breath away. The report I heard in my country about your deeds and your wisdom is true," she told the king. "I did not believe the report until I came and saw with my own eyes that not even half had been told me. Your wisdom and prosperity surpassed the report I heard. Happy are your servants, happy these ministers of yours who stand before you always and listen to your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God, who has been pleased to place you on the throne of Israel." So, and it goes on a little bit more, where she's essentially, and then she ends up giving him a whole bunch of gold and spices, and that, doubled the size of the kingdom's spices or whatever. It's just like all this stuff that she did. And the part that resonated, maybe I heard it for the first time, because your mind wanders at Mass sometimes, right? And what hurt me was like when she saw all this stuff, it said it took her breath away. And interestingly, the image that came to my mind when that happened, it reminded me of when one of the parishes I had been at before had a major renovation inside and redid all of their altar, the sanctuary. They'd put stained glass up in the back and build a baldachin, and it was like all this beautiful big stuff, right? And I was at the back of the church one day. I think I was doing prayers, I don't remember, but it was not during Mass. I was back there in the back just sitting there, and the wedding coordinator had brought a young bride with her mother into the church to show the church, and they were in there for like 10 seconds, and the bride, like, she sort of gasped. I was in the back, and she sort of like, she had this, like, she took her breath, and she said, "This is where I'm getting married." That's what she said. So she had decided that this is where based on seeing what she saw at this parish. It was St. Louis Church in Memphis, by the way. It's beautiful. And she had this moment, and I connected the two of those. And then my mind started going further. And I hear these things, I start like in my mind, like, well, if I was preaching, I would say this, and I just started thinking I started thinking, the Lord started helping me to think and realize that there is something beautiful about how we do liturgy, about what we do as Catholics. that we shouldn't dismiss, that it makes a difference. Where people might think like, does it matter where you get married? I mean, if you get married, right? Whether you're getting married in a plain chapel or whatever, it's like, does it really matter as long as you get married? Does it matter where the Eucharist takes place or how the Eucharist is confected? Does it matter what words are said? Does it matter what languages? Does the music really matter at the end of the day? Does all that stuff matter? And what I started to realize at that moment was it mattered to the Queen of Sheba. Mm-hmm. It took her breath away. And the things that she pointed out, I love where it goes through this list. I mean, this is where Scripture is helping us to see it, because she was attracted by the wisdom, right? She was attracted by, she'd heard, Solomon, a man of great fame for his wisdom mm-hmm. and his great thinking and pondering and all the things he said, right? And so she wanted to go see that. Just like someone might be interested in like, well, I heard those Catholics got something going on. Let me go over there and see what they got going on, right? So she was drawn there. And then it says, Solomon's great wisdom, the house he had built, the food at his table, the seating of his ministers, the attendance and dress of his waiters, his servers, and the burnt offerings. I mean, think about that for a second, like the burnt offerings. You're thinking about like incense at Mass. And you're thinking about, I love this where it talks about the attendance and dress of his waiters. I mean, this is like what they're wearing. And she was blown away by that. That's part of this image that she had. So like vestments at Mass, the beautiful vestments. And we sit and think, and for many, many years, and I don't want to offend anybody, but for so many years we've had, our priests and deacons wearing like these kind of burlap looking things with funky designs on them that are kind of ugly mm-hmm. in my mind. And some people might think they're beautiful, but I don't know that they take your breath away like some of the beautiful, fine vestments that maybe come out of the earlier history of the church, and whether you have like a regular chasuble or a fiddleback chasuble or whatever, I'm not necessarily have a dog in that particular fight, but I do think that like the more ornate and beautiful, the more it takes your breath away. The more that's part of, in the service of the waiters, not just how they were dressed, but how they moved, the liturgical function. And I suddenly started realizing that we as Catholics need to pony up. We need to start up in our game a bit and start to realize that what we do and how we do it, it makes a difference. It has an impact on people that is, I want to say subconscious, but really it just goes right to the heart of our bodies. There's a great image of the church. It's called the Sacrament of Salvation. That's what we call the church. Why? What is a sacrament? A sacrament is something that has an outward sign that connotes an inward grace, a saving grace that's contained within that outward sign. So all of our sacraments, like anointing of the sick, there's oil, a physical, but what it carries with it is actual grace. Mm-hmm. Same thing with baptism. There's water, an outward sign poured over a person's head, is a saving grace. Eucharist is bread and wine consecrated, and those outward signs are the body and blood of Jesus and connote an inward grace that comes to us. In the same way, the church is a visible sign. Mm-hmm. It is an outward sign. So it's a sacrament, right? It has a sacramental character. It has an outward sign. And what's within? Saving grace comes to us through the church in her workings and how she does things. So I'm sorry for the long sort of rant, but this is the experience I had sitting at Mass, like on a regular weekday, and where it's like the longer readings, the Old Testament readings and things that usually just pass over us.
So here's a dumb question, and that is, so is that a communication to the people that are showing up, or is that a communication to God, or both, or what's going on there, do you think?
So I think that's a great question, because it's kind of like, who is this show aimed at?
Right.
Who's listening? Who am I trying to tell this is important? I think first and foremost at the top of the list probably is Catholics, mm-hmm. right? So it's like the people that are there attending. It's like what we do and how we do it matters. And for us to say it doesn't matter is to say, it's the same thing as like having a...
none of it matters then.
Right, exactly. Well, at home, when you have a meal, mm-hmm. why don't we just have peanut butter and jelly every night? Mm-hmm. You could. You'd still be alive today if you had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich every day of your life. That's all you ate. it would be fine. Except there's something beautiful about a meal and how you have a meal and the people that are gathered around the table, but also to have to spend a little time and maybe have a certain kind of meal and varieties of vegetables cooked a certain way, and maybe we'll have a steak on this night, maybe we'll have lobster, whatever. And it's like you start to realize that that's all part of building and growing and sustaining the family. It's not just sustenance, right? You've like watched the sci-fi movies where you eat Soylent Green or whatever instead of it's people. No, but it's like they probably could make some kind of sludge that you drink, that you consume, that has all the nutrients you need to survive, and that's not life. Life is going to be the taste, the textures, and all that stuff in food. In the same way, Tom, I think that when we're talking to Catholics, we all need to understand that beautiful liturgy, beautiful furnishings, beautiful music, just all of that included with the scriptures, the message, and then ultimately the sacrifice of the Mass, what takes place on the altar and what we receive, that's all of that is a big ball, and we need to realize that just like that blushing bride, we need to start to pay attention to how are we going to attract more people to church? I mean, churches aren't doing so well right now. All organized religions are kind of struggling, right? And the reality is, I think the Catholic Church, in modern times has tried everything except for being more Catholic.
Mm-hmm. G.K. Chesterton famously said that the world will be saved by beauty. And it's interesting, you hear that quote and you sit with it, and it might not be obvious what he means when he says that, but I think you're pointing us to what G.K. Chesterton was trying to communicate. And if we look at what St. Thomas Aquinas says about beauty, beauty, and I'm paraphrasing here, it's the joy experienced by the heart when the soul glimpses truth, right? And if we ground ourselves in that recognition of, Bishop Barron often talks about at evangelization, you have to lead with beauty, that in the beauty they'll see goodness, and in the goodness they'll see truth, right? Our minds were created, to have intellect, right, that receives truth. That's the purpose of our minds. But sometimes that's not the best place to start. Sometimes it is. Sometimes people are ready and they want to be fed truth. But sometimes what you need is to have the joy of the heart experienced first when your soul glimpses truth. And that's what beauty is.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you make that connection between the outward signs of beauty and the inward beauty, right? So if you have something that's just inwardly beautiful, that's nice. If you have something that's outwardly beautiful, that's nice, but it's kind of empty, right? Mm-hmm. But when you have something that's outwardly beautiful that essentially speaks to the inner beauty or reflects the inner beauty, that's where you start to see this thing as a sacramental.
Yes.
Right? And you start to view our faith as incarnational. The idea that Jesus, divine, that God would take on flesh. So spirit would become infleshed, like in the physical world. And that's what we need to see the church as, right? Is something that is God breathed, but that takes on a visible character.
Well, and another thing we have to keep in mind is, modern art, and I'm not trying to put down, there's a lot of great works of modern art, right? But the fact of the matter is, modern art, by design, in terms of its philosophical framework, it removes God from being the author of beauty. It makes man the author. It's the meaning that you make, right, when you see it. Even the author's meaning is only a partially relevant. It's also sort of, I took this and this is what it means to me, and it's a very humanistic way of exploring beauty. And of course, I think that God can still anoint artists within that context and can create beauty through those artists. But I think that we, as a people and as a church, in addition to emphasizing the liturgy, there were once upon a time, like in the Renaissance, artists had patrons, and people like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, They actually, if you look at them, I think all of the great artists like those I just mentioned were celibate. They lived their lives completely giving themselves to art. I mean, that was sort of their priesthood, was making a sacrifice of their lives to bring beauty into the world. And, now we have this sort of liberal economic framework where everybody's got to pay a mortgage and keep up with the Joneses and all of this stuff. And it can really choke the life out of somebody who wants to devote themselves to beauty. And there are things like Patreon and various other alternative frameworks that people are trying to create to help support creators of sacred art. But if we want to see our churches transformed, and if we want to see the culture transformed by sacred art and by beauty anointed by God, we have to pray for those people that God is anointing to create sacred art. And we also have to pray, what can we do to help support them to invite a new renaissance, right, of sacred art within the church, so that G.K. Chesterton's proclamation that the world will be saved by beauty may come to fruition in our time.
And I want to go back and say, I think we should put up a QR code for everyone to be able to donate to their favorite, sacred artist. But as importantly, you rightly point out there's this connection between sacred art and the sacred thing that it depicts.
Yes.
And the place that it takes you. That's what's important to me. Because I know there's been many, or at least I say that's what's important to me. That's what I'm talking about today, right? And there have been so many criticisms of the Catholic Church about how it's like this great warehouse filled with things that are valuable that they could, sell it all and give to the poor and things like that. And there's like, and I don't know about the you do the number crunching and find out that, like, well, if you sold everything, you'd feed all the poor for a day or whatever. I've heard all kinds of arguments. The point, though, is, you don't want to get rid of that which is sacred, because there is something that is not involved in the financial world. When you're looking at something, its value is not specifically financial. Its value is inestimable because it's connected to your spiritual well-being, and it causes you it brings you closer to God. It's not about the money of all the great works of art that the Vatican owns. It's not about that. It's about what's on display and what you see and what you feel and where you're drawn, and the fact that you're coming closer to God. And there's been so many criticisms of the Catholic Church about it's just like this great big warehouse, like at the end of Indiana Jones, where they store all the expensive stuff, tucked away from the world. And that's not the case. And I love, there's another image that's given to us in the book of the prophet Isaiah. In the 54th chapter, there's a sort of a prefigurement of the church. And they're talking about the new Zion. And what Isaiah writes here in let's see, this is 54th chapter, verse 11. And this is an image of the church. And this is the image of the church that he gives us, foreshadowing the church that is today, right? It says, "O afflicted one, storm-battered and unconsoled, I lay your pavements in carnelians, your foundations in sapphires. I will make your battlements of rubies, your gates of jewels, and all your walls of precious stones. All your children shall be taught by the Lord. Great shall be the peace of your children. In justice shall you be established. Far from oppression, you shall not fear. From destruction it cannot come near. If there be an attack, it is not my doing. Whoever attacks shall fall before you. See, I have created the smith who blows on the burning coals and forges weapons as his work. It is I also who have created the destroyer to work havoc. Every weapon fashioned against you shall fail. Every tongue that brings you to trial, you shall prove false." I mean, this is like the church that cannot be beaten down. But what is the image of the church, other than being strong and having the weapons that are forged by the Lord, is like sapphires and rubies and gates of jewels. Like, there's something beautiful. And in that right there, when I see that, I sit there and think, like, well, Isaiah is prophesying a church that has, beautiful jewels sewn into vestments, beautiful jewel encrusted plates and dishes on the altar.
Right.
And it's like, it's more than just plates and dishes, right? Suddenly, It's a beautiful table laid before it and becomes an altar of sacrifice. And so these beautiful gold tabernacles, right? And you start to see these things that are of great earthly value, but their earthly value really is stored up in the fact that there's great spiritual value in them.
Well, and you also pointed out the Queen of Sheba. She was also taken by the attendants and everybody else and how they were dressed.
The movements and all the stuff they did.
Yeah, well, I think in addition to that, it's not just on the clergy and the acolytes, but also on the laity in terms of how we prepare ourselves, in terms of how we dress for Mass and how we present ourselves to the Lord when we come to Sunday liturgy. When we hear the word modesty, a lot of times we only think in terms of like sexually alluring clothes being prohibited and stuff like that. But if you actually look at what St. Thomas Aquinas teaches about the virtue of modesty, what it actually is a virtuous regard for one's externals, right? Where your virtuous interior life is reflected in you and your externals and how you carry yourself, and decorum is a part of that as well. And so if we also we talked about art being properly understood as being authored by God. If we receive ourselves as authored by God and we present ourselves as God's children in the way in which we are dressed, and we are putting effort into looking as good as we can as we come, especially to Sunday Mass, to celebrate, I think that also can add to it, and the reverence by which we share in the liturgy and the piety by which we kneel and by which we worship Him. I think that's relevant too.
Right. So things like you're not chewing gum, right? You're doing your best to pay attention. And even though this whole story came about because my mind sometimes wanders at Mass, and we all have that temptation, and yet once we start to pay attention, we'll start to the Lord speaks to us through those scriptures and through the movements and through all the beauty and through all the orchestration through every aspect of the Mass, and that's why it's important. Now, I'm not saying that it has to be a traditional Latin Mass or that it has to be a Novus Ordo Mass. What I'm saying is it has to be reverent and beautiful Mass, and if we put all of our efforts into doing the best that we can in orchestrating this and putting this all together, and then we do the best that we can in receiving that which has been orchestrated for us, then good things are going to happen.
You mentioned also in terms of the liturgy, something that comes to mind is music. And I heard a priest give an interesting reflection online not too long ago where he said, classical music, that appeals to the intellect. A lot of this rock music and folk music and more modern music appeals to feelings, right? And he said, but something about Gregorian chant, which is supposed to have pride of place according to the Vatican II document, Sacrosanctum Concilium. The point he raised is that actually Gregorian chant it reaches the will. It takes the will and it lifts the will up to God, and God is the source of all beauty. So even if someone says, I really don't think of Gregorian chant as being in itself the most beautiful, it's like, well, okay, that's fine, but let it step into that space of Gregorian chant and let it enter your heart and lift your heart up to He who is beauty itself.
Yeah, 100%. And I started listening recently to there's a guy named Paul Rose up in the Northeast who does Sing the Hours podcast.
Oh wow,
I love it, and it's like
he's doing that now.
Yeah, as an ordained cleric, I'm as a deacon in my diocese, I'm obligated to do morning and evening prayer, and the liturgy of the hours, and what I've found is this podcast is wonderful because it's got just the right of mix in it, and he changes things up every once in a while, where sometimes he'll sing he'll sing the Magnificat in Latin, but the whole thing is chanted. The entire liturgy of the hours is chanted from start to finish. The reading, the responsory, and it's just beautiful. And I just want to give a shout out to, I don't know this guy, but you can find it. Just go to Sing the Hours. It's it's a podcast that this guy does, and he does it every day faithfully, a morning and evening prayer, and it's just quite beautiful. And it really helps me then, because I've been doing morning and evening prayer for like the 16 years that I've been a deacon. And the thing is, sometimes you can just sit there and it becomes an obligation that you fulfill, right? You read it. But this now, I'm able to have it when I can. I have it open. My wife Bess loves it. She keeps it. She told me to stop calling her Saint, by the way. But anyway, Saint Bess, she will have her liturgy of the hour. She'll have it open. She's reading it as he's singing it, and it's just you just go deep, right?
Oh, yeah.
And then he'll spice it up. He'll have Latin here and there. And I'm starting to learn the Pater Noster. We just noticed last night. It's like, hey, we almost know the whole thing now. Oh, wow. And I know there are people that are light years ahead of me. I know they are, but I wasn't raised that way, right? I was born in 1962, and all that stuff fell apart. And now I'm sort of like reclaiming some of that and realizing that when he starts chanting Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, it's like I'm like glory to the Father and Son. It's like, and I know that now.
And for those of us who might live close to a monastery, or
go
convent,
and listen to their vespers. Some vespers are beautiful,
incredible.
It's beautiful. And someone might say like, well, why are you over there praying in Latin? You don't even understand those words. It's like because it takes you somewhere else.
Yeah,
it takes you closer to God, and you're like listening. That's where that Gregorian chant. I agree, So there's something powerful about that. I think that we dismiss so easily.
All of it matters.
Yeah, and I think it all matters. So, wow, that was a lot of stuff to talk about, but it makes a difference. And let's just pray that the church continues to be this visible sign, the sacrament of salvation for all. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Thanks for listening to the Catholic Cafe. If you'd like to contact Deacon Jeff, send him an email at deaconjeff@thecatholiccafe.com. Visit us on the web at thecatholiccafe.com. You can also find us on iTunes or follow us on Facebook and Twitter. The Catholic Cafe is brought to you by the Order of Malta, Federal Association. Join us again at the Catholic Cafe, serving up salvation one cup of coffee at a time.